A shocking incident of racial profiling left an esteemed military leader in handcuffs, exposing deep-rooted prejudice within law enforcement. The confrontation between uniformed bigotry and decorated authority would soon escalate beyond a local police precinct, reaching the highest echelons of military command. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The icy March wind whipped through Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, cutting like a knife through the evening air. Major General Sarah Johnson pulled her grey wool coat tighter around her shoulders as she stepped into the shadowed parking structure, her military bearing momentarily hidden beneath civilian clothes. Her black gloves gripped the handle of her leather briefcase containing classified documents she'd been reviewing during her flight from Washington. She paused at level 3 of the concrete structure, scanning for her assigned driver, who should have been waiting. The Pentagon had arranged transportation to take her to a classified briefing at a nearby military installation, but there was no sign of the vehicle. Sarah checked her watch 20 minutes late already. Overhead, a commercial airliner roared across the Texas sky, its engines drowning out the footsteps approaching from behind. Unbeknownst to her, 3 uniformed officers had been tracking her movements since she exited the terminal. They watched from behind a concrete pillar, exchanging glances before nodding to each other. Something about her deliberate movements and alertness had triggered their suspicion. "Excuse me, ma'am," Officer Robert Davis called out, his voice sharp and authoritative as he approached with his hand resting on his holster. "What are you doing here?" Sarah turned calmly, her expression composed despite the officer's confrontational tone. "Waiting for my driver, officer. Is there a problem?" "ID, please," Davis demanded, his eyes narrowing as he studied her face. The general reached into her coat pocket and produced her Pentagon identification card. "I'm Major General Sarah Johnson. I'm here on official business." Barely glanced at the military ID before handing it to Sergeant James Miller beside him. "Right. And I'm the Secretary of Defense," he said with a dismissive snort. "Sir, if you'd just verify," Sarah began. But before she could finish, Officer Clark moved behind her. "Hands behind your back," Davis ordered, pulling out his handcuffs. "This is a mistake," Sarah stated firmly, her dignity intact even as cold steel pressed against her wrists. The metallic click echoed through the parking structure, louder somehow than the jet passing overhead. Several travelers stopped to stare at the unfolding scene. "I need to make a call," she said, her voice steady despite the humiliation burning through her. "My phone is in my right pocket. It's encrypted. I need to contact my superiors at the Pentagon immediately." "Sure you do," Officer Davis replied with a smirk. "You can make all the calls you want down at the station." Sarah's request was flatly denied as the officers began leading her toward their waiting police cruiser, unaware that they had just made a catastrophic error in judgment that would soon reverberate through corridors of power across the nation. A crowd began to form around the perimeter of the confrontation, their expressions a mixture of discomfort and morbid curiosity. Some travelers quickened their pace, eyes cast downward as they hurried past the scene, unwilling to witness the humiliation of a black woman at the hands of authority. Others slowed their stride, pulling out smartphones to capture what was unfolding, the uncomfortable reality of a decorated military officer in handcuffs. Major General Sarah Johnson maintained her composure, her posture remaining military straight despite the cold metal biting into her wrist. Her dark eyes, steady and resolute, never wavered from Officer Robert Davis's face. Though outwardly calm, a burning sense of humiliation coursed through her veins, not just personal shame, but the weight of what this represented for every person who had ever worn the uniform and looked like her. "I have the right to make a call," she stated evenly, her voice carrying the authority of her rank despite her current position. "You'll get your call at the station," Davis replied dismissively, his hand firmly gripping her upper arm. The March wind whistled through the parking structure, carrying whispers from the growing audience. "Is that really necessary?" someone murmured. "She showed him ID," another voice added, uncertainty hanging in the frigid air. Hidden in the shadows between 2 parked vehicles, Major Michael Smith watched the scene unfold with growing alarm. The military aide had arrived early to meet his superior and now found himself witness to something that violated everything he understood about respect and protocol. His heart hammered against his ribcage, but years of training kept his movements measured and deliberate. Smith glanced around, confirming no one was watching him, then slowly reached into his jacket pocket. With practiced precision, He withdrew his secure device standard issue for Pentagon personnel with his clearance level. His fingers moved swiftly across the screen, activating the Echo 6 protocol designed specifically for situations where verbal communication was impossible or dangerous. The aide's thumb hovered for just a moment before pressing the emergency contact. The Pentagon's secure line connected silently, the device vibrating once to confirm transmission. No words needed to be spoken. The activation of Echo 6 from a registered device would trigger an immediate response protocol, sending Sarah's GPS coordinates and security clearance level to military command. As the crowd continued to grow and more devices recorded the incident, Smith slipped the secure phone back into his pocket. He knew what was coming. It was only a matter of time before the chain of command would respond to one of their highest-ranking officers being detained without cause. His gaze met Sarah's briefly across the distance, and he gave an almost imperceptible nod. Help was already on the way. The radio on Officer Robert Davis's shoulder crackled with sudden static, cutting through the tense silence of the parking structure. Echo 6 confirmed, stand by. The unexpected transmission echoed between the concrete pillars, carrying a weight that none of the officers fully comprehended. Major General Sarah Johnson recognized the code instantly. Echo 6 was Pentagon shorthand for a high-priority security alert involving military personnel. Someone had activated the protocol. Her eyes darted briefly to the shadows where she had last seen Major Smith before the officers approached her. "What the hell is Echo 6? Sergeant James Miller muttered, his hand instinctively moving toward his weapon. The confidence that had radiated from the three officers moments before evaporated like morning dew under a harsh sun. Officer Clark pressed his finger against his earpiece. "Dispatch, please repeat last transmission." "What's the source?" His voice betrayed a nervousness that hadn't been present when they'd surrounded Sarah minutes earlier. The parking structure fell into an uneasy stillness. Travelers wheeling luggage slowed their pace, sensing the shift in atmosphere. A commercial airliner roared overhead, its thunderous engines momentarily drowning out the hushed conversations between the officers. "Sir," Sarah spoke calmly, her military bearing intact, despite the handcuffs biting into her wrists. "I strongly suggest you verify my credentials before this escalates further." The wind whipped through the open structure, carrying her measured words to the growing audience of onlookers. Davis's face hardened, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes. He stepped away from the group, speaking urgently into his radio. The other officers maintained their positions, but their postures had changed, more defensive than authoritative now. "We have protocols to follow," Miller announced loudly, seemingly more for the benefit of the witnesses than for Sarah. "We're just doing our job, ma'am." Sarah stood perfectly still, her dignity intact despite the public humiliation. The bitter March air cut through her wool coat, but she refused to shiver. 27 years of military service had taught her patience in the face of adversity. This parking lot was just another battlefield, albeit one she never expected to encounter on American soil. From his concealed position, Major Smith watched the scene unfold, his secure device still warm in his palm. The Echo 6 protocol was already racing through military channels, but he knew help wouldn't arrive immediately. Pentagon wheels turned methodically, even in emergencies. The handcuffs remained locked around Sarah's wrists, cold steel against her skin. Her military ID lay ignored on the ground where Officer Davis had dropped it. But something had changed. The balance of power had shifted, almost imperceptibly. The officers now stood in a defensive formation, their earlier confidence replaced by growing apprehension as they waited for further instructions. Within the hour, a bystander's shaky video of the arrest hit social media. The footage, captured on a smartphone from behind a concrete pillar, showed Major General Sarah Johnson standing with perfect military posture despite the handcuffs binding her wrists. Her face remained composed, a mask of dignity even as Officer Robert Davis roughly guided her toward the police cruiser. The video caught Davis's dismissive tone as he ignored her repeated requests to verify her credentials. "Is this how we treat our military leaders now?" The first viral comment, posted by a veteran from Fort Hood. The video accumulated 50,000 views in the first 20 minutes alone. By sunset it had reached millions. Sarah's aide watched in horror as the footage spread across platforms. Major Smith frantically called Pentagon contacts, knowing the visual evidence would escalate the situation beyond their control. The timestamp on the video, 3:27 p.m., would become infamous in military circles. A news helicopter hovered over the airport parking structure by early evening, capturing aerial footage of the scene long after Sarah had been released. Local Dallas stations interrupted regular programming, their anchors struggling to explain how a three-star general could be detained without proper verification protocols. The woman in handcuffs is Major General Sarah Johnson, one of the highest-ranking black female officers in our military, announced a somber-voiced reporter. Sources confirm she was attempting to show identification when officers restrained her. Overnight, hashtags demanding justice flooded social media feeds. Military families from Arlington to Bethesda shared their own stories of discrimination. Veterans groups issued statements of outrage, their carefully worded press releases barely concealing their fury at the treatment of one of their own. By dawn, the original video had been viewed 8 million times. News outlets from across the country dispatched reporters to Dallas, transforming a personal humiliation into a national conversation about respect, authority, and race. Sarah sat in her Maryland home, blinds drawn against the gathering media outside, watching her ordeal replay on every channel. The woman on screen, standing tall despite the handcuffs, seemed like a stranger to her now. She turned off her phone as messages poured in from colleagues, friends, and journalists, seeking comment. "How could this happen?" demanded online commentator. A decorated officer who served her country treated like a common criminal. The question echoed across America. How could those sworn to protect and serve so casually strip dignity from someone who had dedicated her life to the same oath of service? As Sarah watched the debate unfold, she realized her private humiliation had become a very public reckoning. The outrage over Major General Sarah Johnson's arrest had barely begun to swell when a more insidious narrative emerged online. 3 days after the incident, anonymous accounts on local forums in Arlington and Bethesda began posting elaborate theories questioning her identity and motives. "Has anyone verified she's actually military?" wrote one user with an American flag avatar. Convenient how she was alone when this happened. The post garnered hundreds of comments within hours. Sarah discovered these threads while recovering at home, her morning coffee turning cold as she scrolled through page after page of accusations. Some claimed she was wearing an inaccurate uniform beneath her coat. Others suggested she had orchestrated the entire confrontation as a publicity stunt to undermine law enforcement. "They're saying I planted someone to record it," she told Major Smith over a secure call, her voice hollow with disbelief. The aide had been monitoring the online response, watching helplessly as the conspiracy theories multiplied. "It's coordinated," Michael replied, having traced several accounts to the same IP addresses. "Someone wants to control the narrative before the department investigation begins." The allegations grew more outlandish by the day. Doctored photos appeared showing Sarah at political rallies she had never attended. Self-proclaimed military experts dissected her service record on video streams, questioning decorations she had earned in combat zones they had never visited. In 27 years of military service, the general had faced enemy fire, navigated political minefields at the Pentagon, and broken barriers as a black woman in leadership. Yet nothing had prepared her for becoming the target of faceless accusers who questioned not just her actions, but her very identity. "They're calling me a crisis actor," she told General Thompson during their weekly check-in. Williams' usual confident demeanor faltered as he admitted the Pentagon was monitoring the situation with growing concern. "This isn't just about you anymore, Sarah," he said. "They're using you to undermine trust in both military and civilian leadership." That night, alone in her Maryland home, Sarah found herself doing something she hadn't done since basic training, double-checking the locks on her doors and windows. The threats remained virtual, but the weight of them felt physical, pressing down on her shoulders as she moved through rooms that no longer felt secure. For the first time in her decorated career, Sarah questioned whether truth alone would be enough. The system she had served faithfully for decades now seemed powerless against anonymous forums and viral lies. The battle for justice would require new tactics, and she wasn't certain she had the right weapons for this kind of war. In the days that followed the incident, Arlington City Councilwoman Jennifer Brown stood before a packed chamber, her voice steady but tinged with barely contained anger. As the daughter of a Vietnam veteran, she understood the weight of service all too well. What happened at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport wasn't just an isolated incident, she declared, gripping the podium. It was a fundamental betrayal of the values our community holds dear. The public hearing she'd called attracted national media attention. Cameras flashed as Jennifer outlined the facts. A decorated major general detained without proper verification, denied her rights, and humiliated in public view. The councilwoman's motion for an independent investigation passed unanimously, despite whispered resistance from the police union. When we allow those in uniform to be mistreated, she continued, we undermine the very foundation of respect our society claims to uphold. From her living room in Maryland, Sarah Johnson watched the proceedings on her television, the volume low so as not to disturb the fragile peace she'd managed to create in her home. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a mug of tea gone cold. The general had faced insurgents and diplomatic crises with unwavering composure, yet this battle felt different, more personal, more insidious. On screen, Officer Robert Davis and his colleagues sat stone-faced behind their legal representation. Their attorney spoke of proper procedures and reasonable suspicion, carefully avoiding any mention of Sarah's race or gender. The strategy was clear: frame this as protocol, not prejudice. Social media told a different story. Sarah's phone buzzed constantly with notifications, some supportive, others vicious. Anonymous accounts questioned her credentials, her character, even her patriotism. The battle lines were being drawn, not just in council chambers, but across digital platforms where truth competed with fiction. This isn't just about me anymore, Sarah whispered to herself, closing the live stream as the hearing adjourned for the day. She called her daughter Simone that evening, trying to shield the young woman from the worst of it, while still being honest about what lay ahead. The hardest fights, she told her, are the ones where the enemy isn't clearly defined. As Sarah prepared for bed that night, she realized with startling clarity that winning this battle would require more than facts and testimony. Public perception would ultimately determine whether justice prevailed. The military had taught her strategy and tactics, but nothing had prepared her for a war fought in courtrooms and comment sections, where truth was just one weapon among many. Major Michael Smith's split-second decision to activate the Echo 6 protocol reverberated through secure military channels like a silent alarm. Within minutes of Sarah Johnson's humiliating detention, encrypted messages flashed across terminals in the Pentagon's Crisis Response Center. Senior officers exchanged concerned glances as the alert code indicated a high-ranking official in potential danger. "One of our generals has been detained by local law enforcement," whispered a communications specialist to her superior. "Dallas Airport, no charges specified." The news traveled through the labyrinthine corridors of the Pentagon with remarkable speed and discretion. General William Thompson was in a budget meeting when his aides slipped him a handwritten note. His face remained impassive, but those who knew him well recognized the subtle tightening around his eyes. In her Maryland home, Sarah's secure phone began ringing incessantly. Old West Point classmates, fellow officers from her tours in Afghanistan, veterans advocacy groups, all reaching out with messages of support and outrage. The military community closed ranks around her with quiet efficiency. "This isn't just about you anymore," said a retired colonel, who had served with Sarah in her early career. "They need to understand they can't treat our people this way." Each call and message carried the same undercurrent. Her ordeal had become a flashpoint for something much larger. Sarah sat at her kitchen table, methodically documenting every interaction from the airport incident, while her daughter Simone brought her cups of tea that went cold, untouched. "Mom, your phone keeps buzzing," Simone said. Concern etching her young face, Sarah nodded absently, her mind calculating the ramifications. As a black woman who had risen to the rank of Major General, she had navigated countless subtle and not-so-subtle barriers. But this public humiliation struck at something fundamental. If someone with her credentials could be handcuffed without cause, what hope did junior officers of color have? Meanwhile, at the Pentagon, Ms. Linda Harris was assembling a preliminary incident report. The civilian liaison reviewed Major Smith's account with growing alarm. The aide's quick thinking had potentially prevented a disastrous escalation, but the damage was already done. "We need to contain this," a senior official suggested during an emergency briefing. "With respect, sir," Harris replied, "I believe containment is no longer possible. This is about accountability now." As night fell, Sarah stood at her living room window, watching security personnel discreetly positioned outside her home, protection arranged by Thompson without her asking. Her phone buzzed again with another message of solidarity, and she realized the battle lines were being drawn. What had begun as a personal indignity was transforming into a test of the military's willingness to stand up for its own. The Dallas morning news cycle exploded when an anonymous source leaked a 300-page watchdog report to major networks. The document revealed that Sergeant James Miller and Officer David Clark, two of the officers who had handcuffed Major General Sarah Johnson at the airport, had accumulated 17 prior complaints for unjustified stops targeting black civilians over the past 3 years. CNN broke the story first, with other networks quickly following. The documents were devastatingly comprehensive. Internal emails showed Miller bragging about keeping certain neighborhoods in check, while disciplinary notes documented Clark's pattern of excessive force during routine traffic stops. Most damning were the warning memos from supervisors that had been systematically ignored or buried. "This isn't about one incident anymore," said a somber-faced anchor on the evening news. "We're seeing evidence of a systemic failure within Dallas law enforcement." The report contained testimony from 8 victims who described nearly identical experiences, being approached without cause, having identification questioned despite proper documentation, and facing escalating hostility when they attempted to assert their rights. 3 of these cases involved military personnel. Sarah watched the coverage from her kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of cold coffee. The vindication she felt was hollow. These revelations wouldn't erase her humiliation, but they confirmed what she had suspected all along. This wasn't about a mistaken identity, it was about a broken system. The Dallas Police Department hastily called a press conference, but their spokesperson appeared flustered and unprepared. When asked about the 17 complaints against Miller and Clark, he stumbled through a non-answer about ongoing internal reviews. By evening, protesters had gathered outside police headquarters. Veterans in uniform stood silently alongside community activists, their presence more powerful than any shouted slogan. In Washington, Pentagon officials watched with growing concern. The incident had evolved from an embarrassing mishap into a potential crisis of public trust. General William Thompson paced his office, phone pressed to his ear as he coordinated with military and civilian leadership. "Sarah deserves better than this," he told his aide, "and so do the people of Dallas." The report's most troubling revelation came buried on page 73. Officer Robert Davis, who had placed the handcuffs on Sarah's wrists, had been Miller's training officer. The chain of misconduct stretched back years, suggesting a culture of protection rather than accountability. As night fell across Texas, the credibility of the entire Dallas police force hung by a thread, unraveling in real time on national television. For Sarah, watching from hundreds of miles away, justice finally seemed possible, though its price was proving steeper than anyone had imagined. The news spread through veterans' networks like wildfire. By dawn, what began as outraged text messages between former service members transformed into a coordinated movement that would make headlines across America. Veterans from Fort Hood, Arlington, and bases across the country mobilized with military precision, arriving at the Pentagon in waves of silent solidarity. They came without fanfare, men and women who had served in deserts, jungles, and mountains around the world. Some wore their dress uniforms, medals glinting in the morning sun. Others came in civilian clothes, their military bearing the only hint of their service. They carried crisp white banners with 3 simple words: respect above all. Major General Sarah Johnson watched the gathering from her office window, her throat tightening as she recognized faces from different chapters of her career. A former sergeant she'd mentored in Afghanistan stood shoulder to shoulder with a retired colonel who'd once doubted her abilities. Their differences dissolved in the face of injustice. "They're standing 10 deep now," Major Michael Smith said quietly, as he entered her office with a stack of reports. The aide had been fielding calls all morning, his phone buzzing constantly with messages of support. Sarah nodded, unable to speak as she watched the silent formation grow. The protesters didn't chant or march, they simply stood at attention, a living testament to the dignity the Dallas officers had tried to strip away in that airport parking structure. News vans lined the perimeter, cameras capturing the powerful image of veterans standing in perfect formation, their discipline a stark contrast to the chaos of the arrest video that had circulated online. CNN, Fox, MSNBC, all broadcasting the same powerful scene. The White House called, Michael added. They want to know if you'll make a statement. She turned from the window, composure regained. Not yet. This isn't about me anymore. By afternoon, the silent protest had been featured on every major network. Social media amplified the message, with hashtags demanding accountability trending nationwide. What had begun as a local editing Dallas had transformed into a national conversation about respect, authority, and justice. In her Maryland home that evening, Sarah received a call from Jennifer Brown. The councilwoman's voice was charged with energy. The governor just announced a state-level investigation, she said. Your story is changing things, Sarah. For the first time since cold metal had closed around her wrists, Sarah felt a surge of genuine hope. The burden she'd carried alone in that parking structure was now being shouldered by thousands. Her personal humiliation had become a catalyst for change, and perhaps, just perhaps, something meaningful would emerge from her ordeal. The manila envelope sat on Major General Sarah Johnson's kitchen table, its red, urgent stamp stark against the pale paper. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, revealing the official letterhead of the House Committee on Government Reform. The summons was clear. She was to testify about her experience at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. Sarah sank into her chair, the weight of what this meant settling over her. Never in American history had a three-star general been called to testify against active-duty local law enforcement. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about setting a precedent that could reshape accountability in law enforcement nationwide. She poured herself a cup of coffee, watching steam rise as she contemplated the risk. Her military career, built over decades of sacrifice and excellence, could crumble if her testimony was perceived as divisive or politically motivated. The general understood institutional loyalty. It had been her North Star throughout her service. Yet now she was being asked to challenge one system to protect another. That evening, her secure device buzzed with a message from Major Smith. I'll be with you every step of the way, ma'am, he wrote. His unwavering support since that March day had become her anchor, reminding her that integrity still mattered in their ranks. Later, General William Thompson called from the Pentagon. Sarah, this testimony could change everything, he said, his voice carrying the gravity of their shared burden. The committee won't go easy on you. They'll question your memory, your motives. I know, Will, she replied, using his first name as she only did in their most honest moments. But if I don't speak, who will? After hanging up, Sarah walked to her study and pulled out her service record. Medals and commendations, physical proof of her dedication to country lay before her. Would they still matter after she testified? Would her voice speaking truth about those handcuffs and the cold dismissal of her identity be enough to overcome the backlash that would surely follow? She drafted her opening statement until midnight, carefully balancing facts with the emotional truth of her experience. The words had to be perfect, measured enough for skeptics, authentic enough for those who needed her courage. As dawn broke over her Maryland home, Sarah stood before her mirror in full dress uniform, medals gleaming. The woman who stared back had faced war zones and military bureaucracy, but this battle would be fought in the court of public opinion, with the entire nation watching. Either change the system or destroy your career, she whispered to her reflection. Then she straightened her shoulders, ready to face whatever came next. The marble columns of the congressional chamber loomed over Major General Sarah Johnson as she took her seat at the witness table. Cameras clicked in rapid succession, their flashes reflecting off her meticulously arranged service medals. The room fell silent as she adjusted the microphone, her composure unwavering despite the weight of the moment. Madam General, please describe the events of March 12th. The committee chairperson began. Sarah's voice remained steady, neither rushed nor hesitant. I was walking through the airport parking structure when 3 officers approached me. When I presented my Pentagon identification, Officer Davis dismissed it without proper examination. Within moments, I was handcuffed. The gallery tensed as she recounted each detail. The bite of cold metal against her wrists, the dismissive tone when she requested to use her encrypted device, the humiliation of being treated like a criminal before dozens of travelers. Did you at any point resist? A congressman asked. No, sir, she replied. 27 years of military service teaches you discipline, even when facing injustice. Across America, millions watched the live broadcast. In veterans' halls from Fort Hood to Arlington, service members gathered around screens, many wiping away tears as the decorated officer described her ordeal with the same precision she might use to detail a military operation. When asked about the aftermath, Sarah's voice finally wavered. "The hardest part was explaining to my daughter why her mother, who commands troops and has served in 3 combat zones, was handcuffed like a common criminal." General William Thompson watched from the Pentagon, his knuckles white as he gripped his desk. The testimony confirmed his worst fears about what his friend had endured. In Bethesda, Ms. Linda Harris took notes furiously, knowing that Sarah's words would form the backbone of new departmental policies. The liaison understood that institutional change would require more than sympathy. It demanded action. "What do you hope comes from these hearings?" The final question came. Sarah straightened her shoulders, addressing not just the committee, but the cameras capturing her every word. "I hope no service member, regardless of rank, race or gender, ever experiences what I did. But more importantly, I hope no American citizen does either." For Black veterans watching, her testimony wasn't merely about one incident. It was acknowledgement of countless similar experiences that had gone unaddressed. For women in uniform, it was confirmation that even at the highest ranks, their authority remained fragile in certain contexts. As Sarah concluded her testimony, social media erupted with hashtags of support. Her courage had transformed a personal humiliation into a national conversation about respect, authority, and the uneven application of justice. The silence that had protected such incidents for decades was finally giving way to truth. The Department of Justice released a scathing 38-page report that sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities nationwide. The document meticulously detailed a pattern of misconduct, illegal detentions without probable cause, unauthorized confiscation of government-issued equipment, and verbal abuse that bordered on intimidation. For Major General Sarah Johnson, the findings validated what she had endured that cold March evening, but the report went further, exposing systemic issues that extended beyond her personal ordeal. The actions taken against Major General Johnson represent a fundamental breakdown in protocol, training, and basic civil rights protections, the report stated in unambiguous language. Within hours of its release, all 3 officers, Robert Davis, James Miller, and David Clark, were suspended indefinitely pending further investigation. Their badges and service weapons were surrendered in a quiet ceremony that contrasted sharply with the public humiliation they had inflicted. Sarah watched the news from her Maryland home, her expression unreadable as reporters dissected every detail. The swift action brought a measure of relief, but she knew better than most that justice rarely arrived without complications. The backlash emerged almost immediately. Conservative talk shows questioned the speed of the suspensions, suggesting political pressure rather than due process. "This is what happens when the Pentagon interferes with local law enforcement," one commentator declared, his voice dripping with disdain. "General Johnson is militarizing justice." Meanwhile, activist groups in Dallas and beyond argued the suspensions were merely symbolic. They demanded structural overhauls, civilian oversight boards, mandatory body cameras, and independent prosecutors for cases involving abuse of authority. Their rallying cry grew louder. The system protected her because of her rank. What about the rest of us? Jennifer Brown, the city councilwoman who had first called for hearings, found herself caught between competing demands. "This isn't about choosing sides," she told reporters outside City Hall. "It's about ensuring that what happened to Major General Johnson never happens to anyone else, regardless of their uniform or lack thereof." As the media frenzy intensified, Sarah received a private call from Linda Harris at the Defense Department. "The battle lines are being drawn," the liaison warned, "and you're standing at the center of a fight much bigger than 3 officers in a parking garage." Sarah nodded, though Linda couldn't see her through the phone. "I never wanted to be a symbol," she replied quietly. "But if that's what it takes to change things, I'll stand my ground." That evening, as protesters gathered outside police headquarters with signs demanding justice for all, the invisible lines that had always divided their community became unmistakably visible in the harsh glare of public scrutiny. The Pentagon's response came with unprecedented speed. Within 3 weeks of Major General Sarah Johnson's testimony, a memorandum circulated through every military and law enforcement agency in the country. The new guidelines were unambiguous. Any individual presenting military credentials, regardless of attire or circumstance, must have their identity verified by a designated liaison officer before any detainment could occur. Operation Verification, as it became known internally, represented a seismic shift in protocol. Sarah watched from her office as the policy she had inadvertently inspired transformed into reality. The directive required police departments nationwide to establish direct communication channels with military bases in their jurisdictions, creating a safety net that hadn't existed before that cold March eve. "This is what institutional change looks like," General William Thompson told her during a private meeting at the Pentagon. His initial hesitation had given way to fierce advocacy once he'd seen the surveillance footage from the airport. "But are you prepared for what comes next?" Sarah understood his concern. Her name now appeared in policy documents, training manuals, and news headlines. What had begun as a humiliating personal ordeal had evolved into a case study taught at police academies and military leadership courses. The Johnson Protocol, some called it. The victory came with a steep price. Reporters camped outside her Maryland home, forcing Simone to stay with relatives in Bethesda. Anonymous threats arrived daily, each one meticulously documented by security personnel assigned to protect her. Her morning runs, once a solitary ritual, now required an escort. "Mom, there's someone at school saying you're trying to destroy the police," Simone said during one of their nightly calls, her voice small and confused. These moments cut deeper than the handcuffs ever had. Miss Linda Harris, who had become an unexpected ally, offered perspective during their weekly debriefs. "Change this fundamental always costs something," the liaison explained, sliding a folder of implementation reports across the table. "But look at what you've built." The folder contains testimonials from service members across all branches, stories of respect where there had once been suspicion, of verification replacing assumption. A female lieutenant from Fort Hood wrote about being properly identified during a traffic stop, the officer following the new protocol to the letter. Sarah traced her fingers over the words, remembering the cold steel against her wrists. Major Michael Smith had been right when he activated Echo 6 that day. Sometimes the system needed breaking before it could be rebuilt. As she closed the folder, Sarah knew that while her privacy had shattered, something far more important had been preserved: the dignity of those who would follow in her footsteps. General William Thompson stared at the blank document on his computer screen, the cursor blinking accusingly. His office at the Pentagon felt unusually quiet that evening, the weight of his impending decision hanging in the air. As chairman of the Joint Chiefs, his words carried immense weight, a responsibility he never took lightly. Sarah Johnson had been more than a colleague for 20 years. They'd served together in 3 combat zones, attended the same strategy briefings, and shared countless meals in military mess halls across the globe. Now she needed him, but supporting her publicly meant potentially undermining the institutions they both had sworn to protect. "Damn it," William muttered, running his hand over his silver-cropped hair. He began typing again, crafting what would be his 5th attempt at a statement. The words flowed this time, a powerful condemnation of the treatment Sarah had endured, coupled with a call for accountability within law enforcement ranks. The general paused, reading over what he'd written. It was good, too good. If released, his statement would certainly make headlines nationwide. The military community would rally behind Sarah even more fervently. But what about the fragile relationship between military and civilian authorities, between citizens and those sworn to protect? William reached for his secure phone, nearly calling Sarah before thinking better of it. This wasn't her burden to carry. The decision was his alone. On his wall hung photographs chronicling his 40-year career, including one with Sarah at her promotion ceremony to Major General. He'd pinned the stars on her shoulders himself, both of them beaming with pride. That day seemed impossibly distant now. "Sir?" His aide knocked softly. "The White House is requesting your position statement by morning." William nodded. "Thank you. I'll have it ready." After the aide departed, he opened his desk drawer and pulled out a handwritten letter from Simone, Sarah's daughter. The girl had written to him weeks ago, her childish handwriting describing nightmares about her mother being taken away. The letter had arrived addressed simply to Mum's friend, the important general. He placed the letter beside his keyboard and began typing again, more decisively this time. History would judge them all, the officers who had acted with prejudice, the institutions that had failed, and the leaders who chose silence over justice. By midnight, William completed his statement. It was measured but unequivocal in its support for Sarah Johnson and its call for systematic change. Tomorrow he would deliver it personally to the White House, knowing full well it might cost him relationships, influence, even his position. Some burdens were worth carrying, some friendships worth defending, some principles non-negotiable. Linda Harris stood before her bathroom mirror, adjusting her navy blazer with trembling fingers. The Pentagon liaison had spent 15 years building a reputation for efficiency and discretion. Now, as her face appeared on morning news programs, that carefully constructed facade was crumbling. When the Echo 6 protocol had activated that March evening, Linda had been the one to coordinate the Pentagon's response. She'd followed procedure perfectly, making the necessary calls, filing the appropriate reports. But watching Major General Sarah Johnson's humiliation through grainy cell phone footage had awakened something dormant inside her. "You're just doing your job," her supervisor had assured her when the congressional inquiry began. But those words rang hollow now. Linda knew better than anyone how the system protected itself. She'd spent a decade helping it do exactly that. The liaison remembered a similar incident in Arlington 6 years earlier, a black naval officer detained outside a government facility. Despite proper credentials, she'd helped bury that report, classifying it as a procedural misunderstanding rather than the clear violation it was. The memory burned like acid in her stomach. Sarah's dignity throughout the ordeal had been a mirror reflecting Linda's own compromises. While the general stood firm against injustice, Linda had spent years looking away, prioritizing institutional stability over individual dignity. "I need to volunteer," she told her supervisor the next morning, voice steadier than she felt. "I have relevant testimony about departmental response patterns." The Pentagon corridors fell silent as she walked to the legal office. Colleagues who had praised her efficiency now averted their eyes, uncertain where their loyalties should lie in this shifting landscape. When Linda finally sat across from Sarah at the preparation meeting, the weight of unspoken understanding passed between them. "I've been complicit," Linda admitted, her professional mask finally slipping. "There were other cases I helped minimize." The general studied her with those penetrating eyes that had stared down Officer Davis without flinching. "Then help me ensure this never happens again," she said simply. Linda's testimony became a turning point in the hearings. She brought forth not just her experience with Sarah's case, but documentation of 12 similar incidents spanning 7 years. Her institutional knowledge transformed individual injustice into demonstrable patterns. "The system isn't broken," she testified, voice carrying through the chamber. "It's functioning exactly as designed, to protect itself rather than serve those who serve our country." For the first time in 15 years, Linda slept soundly that night. She had chosen the harder path, confronting her own complicity rather than hiding behind procedure. In doing so, she offered something beyond justice for one general, a roadmap for healing the institution they both still believed in. As the congressional hearings stretched into their third week, Major General Sarah Johnson found herself trapped in a different kind of battlefield. Her days were consumed by testimonies and cross-examinations, but nights brought no respite. Each evening she would return to her temporary apartment in Arlington, mechanically prepare a simple meal, and then lie awake, staring at the ceiling until exhaustion finally claimed her. When sleep did come, it arrived contaminated with memory. The cold metal of handcuffs against her wrists morphed seamlessly into the restraints she'd once seen on prisoners during her second tour. The echo of Officer Davis's dismissive tone blended with the harsh commands she'd heard in war zone. Sarah would jolt awake, heart racing, the line between past trauma and present reality dangerously blurred. "It's the sound," she confided to General William Thompson during a rare private moment between sessions. "The click of those handcuffs in the parking structure. It's the same sound as weapon safeties being disengaged." Her longtime mentor nodded silently, understanding the invisible wounds that military service had left, now reopened by this new injustice. Her Maryland home stood empty while she remained in Arlington for the hearings. But Simone refused to let distance sever their connection. Every 3 days, a new letter would arrive from Bethesda, where the 12-year-old stayed with her aunt. The envelopes, decorated with colorful stickers and hopeful messages, contained pages filled with uneven handwriting that betrayed her daughter's anxiety. "Mom, I saw you on TV again," one letter began. "My teacher asked if I wanted to stay home, but I said no. Some kids asked weird questions. I told them my mom is a hero, not just because you're a general, but because you're brave even when you're scared." Sarah traced her fingers over the smudged ink, noticing how the pressure of Simone's pencil varied, pressing harder when emotions ran deep, lighter when uncertainty crept in. These letters, these fragile paper bridges between mother and daughter, reminded the seasoned officer what truly hung in the balance. It wasn't just about justice or policy reform anymore. It was about returning to Simone as the mother she deserved, not as the symbol of resistance the media had had her into. It was about ensuring her daughter wouldn't inherit a world where her worth would be questioned based on her skin color, regardless of rank or service. One night, after particularly grueling questioning about her military record, an obvious attempt to undermine her credibility, Sarah carefully folded Simone's latest letter and placed it in her uniform pocket, close to her heart. Tomorrow would bring another battle in the hearing room, but tonight, these words were her armor. Major Michael Smith sat rigidly in the Pentagon's administrative hearing room, surrounded by brass-adorned uniforms and stern faces. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the polished table as a senior bureaucrat leaned forward, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're just an aide, Major. What gave you the authority to activate an Echo 6 protocol? That's reserved for genuine emergencies." Michael maintained his composure despite the dismissive tone. 3 months had passed since that fateful March evening at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, yet the scrutiny of his actions intensified with each passing week. He'd been called overzealous, presumptuous, and worse in hushed corridor conversations. "Sir, with respect, I witnessed a 3-star general being detained without cause. The protocol exists precisely for situations when military personnel are compromised and unable to communicate directly." The room fell silent. His role in the Sarah Johnson incident had become impossible to ignore, especially after the Department of Justice report validated his quick thinking. The Echo 6 activation had created an unbreakable digital record, preserving evidence that might otherwise have disappeared. In the weeks that followed, Michael found himself in an unexpected position of influence. Junior aides began approaching him in the cafeteria, in the parking structure, even in the restrooms, seeking advice, sharing stories of being overlooked, dismissed or silenced. "You stood up when it mattered," one lieutenant whispered, as they passed in a corridor. Most of us would have frozen. Michael recognized the opportunity before him. During a routine staff meeting, he proposed a formal revision to the aide training program, emphasizing situational judgment and ethical decision-making. To his surprise, General William Thompson personally endorsed the initiative. "Smith didn't just follow protocol," Thompson stated firmly to the assembled officers. "He demonstrated the judgment we expect from every member of this institution, regardless of rank." The Smith Protocol, as it came to be informally known, quickly expanded beyond training. Michael established a monthly forum where aides could discuss challenges without fear of reprisal. He created a mentorship program pairing experienced aides with newcomers. Each small change rippled outward, gradually shifting the Pentagon's rigid hierarchy. "I'm not trying to be revolutionary," he explained to Ms. Linda Harris over coffee in the commissary. "I'm just making space for people to do their jobs with dignity." The bureaucrats who had questioned him still watched with skepticism, but they could no longer dismiss him as just an aide. Michael had proven that courage didn't always roar. Sometimes it was the quiet voice that spoke up when everyone else remained silent, changing an institution not through grand gestures but through persistent, determined action. November brought a chill to Washington as the final congressional session convened. Media trucks lined Constitution Avenue, their satellite dishes reaching skyward like mechanical flowers, searching for light. Major General Sarah Johnson emerged from her government vehicle, the same composed demeanor that had carried her through combat zones now serving as armor against the public scrutiny. The marble halls echoed with whispers as Sarah walked toward the chamber. Unlike her first appearance, she wasn't alone. Officers from the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines, some in uniform, others in civilian attire, formed a protective formation around her. Their presence spoke volumes. This wasn't just Sarah's fight anymore. General William Thompson, who had wrestled with his conscience for months, stood prominently among them. His decision to publicly support his friend had finally outweighed institutional caution. "Ready?" he asked quietly as they paused before the massive oak door. Sarah nodded, her eyes reflecting a calm that hadn't been there during earlier hearings. The trauma remained evident in the slight tremor of her hands as she adjusted her uniform, but something else had emerged: resolve. Inside, camera shutters clicked frantically as the general took her seat. The chamber buzzed with anticipation. Committee members shuffled papers while staffers whispered last-minute advice. Jennifer Brown, now a vocal advocate for police reform, watched from the gallery, her presence a reminder of how local outrage had transformed into national reckoning. When called to speak, Sarah approached the microphone with measured steps. The room fell silent. For 9 months, America had debated her case, dissected her identity, questioned her motives. Now everyone leaned forward to hear her final testimony. "Distinguished members of Congress," she began, her voice steady and clear. "I've served this country through 3 combat deployments. I've commanded troops under enemy fire. I've made life-and-death decisions that I carry with me every day." She paused, surveying the room. "But nothing in my military training prepared me for being handcuffed in my own country, by those sworn to protect it." The chamber remained utterly still as she continued. "What happened to me wasn't about one incident or 3 officers. It's about systems that fail to recognize dignity regardless of rank or uniform." Her gaze was unwavering as she delivered the line that would be quoted in every news outlet by nightfall: "You cannot erase a life of service with 1 pair of handcuffs." The weight of her words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Even her most vocal critics seemed momentarily silenced by the simple, devastating truth of her statement. The Department of Justice's final report landed with the force of a thunderclap across law enforcement agencies nationwide. Its recommendations were unequivocal. Officer Robert Davis, Sergeant James Miller, and Officer David Clark were to be permanently dismissed from service. The decision, announced on a crisp autumn morning, sent ripples through police departments from coast to coast. Sarah Johnson watched the news from her office at the Pentagon, her expression unreadable as the faces of the 3 men flashed across the screen. These were the same officers who had placed cold steel around her wrists that March evening, treating her decorated service with casual contempt. Now justice had finally arrived, though it felt hollow against the weight of her experience. "This marks a turning point," declared the Attorney General at a packed press conference. "Major General Johnson's ordeal has become the catalyst for systemic change." Within weeks, new training protocols emerged in police academies across 43 states. The Johnson Protocols, as they became informally known, mandated extensive training on proper identification verification, especially for military personnel. Oversight committees with civilian members were established in major cities, with Arlington and Dallas leading the implementation. Yet for Sarah, victory came with deep personal costs. During quiet moments alone, her hands would sometimes tremble at the phantom sensation of handcuffs. The Major General, who had faced combat with unwavering courage, now flinched at the sight of police cruisers in her rearview mirror. Her trust in the system she had sworn to defend was fundamentally altered. "The reforms are necessary," she confided to General William Thompson during a private meeting at the Pentagon. "But they can't erase what happened." Her ally nodded gravely. "Some wounds don't heal with policy changes," he replied, sliding a folder across his desk, a new assignment far from the public eye, if she wanted it. Meanwhile, Mr. Harris worked tirelessly implementing the new verification systems, finding purpose in transforming Sarah's trauma into institutional safeguards. The liaison's testimony had proven crucial in securing the officer's dismissal, her detailed account of arriving at the airport that night corroborating every element of Sarah's statement. Major Michael Smith received a commendation for his quick thinking with the Echo 6 protocol, though he deflected praise whenever possible. "I just did what anyone would do," he insisted to colleagues. As the headlines gradually faded and new controversies captured public attention, Sarah found herself at a crossroads. The system had eventually worked, but at what cost? The handcuffs were gone, but their imprint remained invisible to others but ever present in her mind. The autumn leaves painted Sarah Johnson's Maryland neighborhood in warm hues as she returned home from the final hearing. Her mailbox overflowed with letters, not just from military personnel, but from civilians who had followed her journey from that fateful March evening to the halls of justice in November. Neighbors who once knew her only as the General on Maple Street now greeted her with quiet nods of respect. Some left homemade meals on her porch. Others simply reached out with handwritten notes, expressing solidarity. The community had transformed around her, becoming a sanctuary rather than just a place to live. One evening, Sarah sat on her porch swing, watching the sunset cast long shadows across her lawn. Her daughter Simone curled beside her, no longer writing worried letters from Bethesda, but present, her head resting on her mother's shoulder. "Mom," Simone whispered, "my teacher used your story in class today." Sarah smiled, squeezing her daughter's hand. The tremor in her own fingers had lessened with time, though certain sounds, the click of a lock, the crackle of radio static, still transported her back to that parking structure. Major Smith visited weekly, bringing Pentagon updates, and occasionally General William Thompson, whose initial hesitation had given way to unwavering support. Their conversations had evolved from strategy to friendship, from justice to healing. "The new protocols are working," Michael told her during one visit. 3 incidents prevented last month alone. His quiet advocacy had earned him recognition, transforming him from just an aide to a respected voice for institutional change. Even Jennifer Brown, the councilwoman who had first demanded accountability, invited Sarah to speak at community forums. Together they created dialogue between veterans and law enforcement, difficult conversations that began with tension but often ended with understanding. Most surprising was the letter from Ms. Linda Harris, who had found her own voice through Sarah's courage. "Your testimony gave me permission to confront my own silence," she wrote. "Sometimes the greatest service is speaking truth when it costs you everything." Sarah kept a small box containing her military medals beside a newer, more meaningful token, a simple bracelet made by a child who had watched her testimony and written, "Heroes stand up even when they're scared." Walking through her garden one morning, Sarah realized that her 27 years of military service hadn't prepared her for this battlefield, one fought not with weapons but with words, courage and vulnerability. The scars remained, invisible but present, reminders that justice came at a price. Yet as veterans from across the country continued reaching out, sharing their own stories of confronting injustice, Sarah understood her greatest victory wasn't the dismissal of officers Davis, Miller and Clark. It was the quiet revolution happening in police departments, military bases, and community meetings nationwide, all because she had refused to remain silent when steel closed around her wrists on that cold March evening.